So we're going to interview Deborah Powney. She's from the University of Central Lancashire, and she's going to be talking about the experiences of male victims of female perpetrated coercive control. And we're just starting with a short video that she's prepared. I think you'll find it's a really interesting talk.
She's thrown heavy and sharp objects at me, including knives, scissors, hammers, heavy ornaments, and has smashed up lots of expensive items, laptops, mobile phones, TV remotes, etc. I feel that if I told her I was finally leaving, she would have attacked me in a violent rage and killed me.
I was whipped across my face and back with a radio aerial, had my testicles squeezed and kicked. My forehead, eyes and cheeks had been gouged by fingernails. I've been punched full in the face in front of her brothers and mother in an attempt to provoke the brothers to fight. I've had golf balls thrown at the back of my head when trying to eat a meal after work, and was also cut across the back of my hands with broken ceramic, amongst many other things.
I firmly believe she's capable of taking the life of me or my children without remorse. She is able to easily gaslight those in a position to help and turns them against me.
She threatened to have me murdered, and I was scared that she might actually stab me. There was a period when I was always looking at her hands to make sure she didn't have a knife in her hand whenever she entered the room.
She fractured my cheek and split my eye. I woke to her jumping on top of me. She knew I had 300 stitches in my lung. Because she lies and people believe her. Because she really hates me, and I believe she would lie to get me into trouble. She tries to get other people to believe that I'm the abuser, and has passed on my details to men who she has to protect her from me. So I worry I could be targeted.
I rarely had food as money went on what she wanted it to go on. My sleep schedule was erratic, and this is part of the reason for the eventual mental health crisis.
Because she is a dangerous liar who will say whatever she wants to get what she wants from whoever she needs it from. If I'd been convicted of the false allegations she accused me of, I would have got 5 years in prison. I still get insecure when I'm out and about. I have to record myself everywhere I go with dash cam, just in case I'm accused again.
She can do and say anything about me, lie to the authorities, raise false allegations, alienate my child against me, and there is nothing I can do about it. I have no rights.
The authorities were on her side. Despite there being no evidence, it was assumed that I was guilty of abusing her.
The threats that she would make things up about me and prevent me seeing the children and lose my job. I thought I could end up homeless with nothing.
I was scared of losing my daughter because I knew she was capable of using a child as a weapon.
Ongoing abuse in the form of false allegations from her and using them to halt family court proceedings and prevent access to my son.
Because my ex-wife is still trying to control me through our children.
My ex is still controlling me through the court system and by continuing to teach my children to hate me.
An ongoing child arrangements case which has lasted a year and a half. It's still a few months from conclusion, and the psychological abuse continues in the allegations being made against me and in the fact-finding hearings when your abuser and their barrister paints you as someone who you're not. When their deception succeeds in the family court, it's very difficult to accept. You know you've done little wrong, and all you want is contact with your children.
If you try to call out the behaviours, these saved behaviour patterns, when you see them in other females, you get labelled as a woman hater, an angry man, and so on.
because I am acutely aware of what is sayable and what is unsayable, and the way in which the truth around domestic abuse is distorted. My partner used to deny that she hit me, and it is very difficult for me, and I presume for other victims too, to confront a society that is sceptical of men who claim to be victims of domestic abuse.
I could not sleep through stress, and would often go for 3 days and nights straight without sleeping. I became unable to handle any stress at all, and even my speech was affected. I went from being quick-witted and articulate to being unable to string a coherent sentence together much of the time.
My life slowly started to revolve entirely around not making her angry. She'd generally get angry just before I was going to go to bed, so I ended up with very little sleep, as she wanted to have entirely circular arguments for hours. My work suffered, and I eventually had to take redundancy.
I struggle to concentrate and sleep. I lost my job, I lost my home. I get emotional and upset regularly. I'm constantly anxious for my child's well-being and future.
I lost 20 kilos and became dangerously underweight. I suffered chest pains, then ended up in hospital with pericarditis. I couldn't sleep or wake up. I wouldn't eat or drink unless it was a whiskey to help me sleep. My friends and family were very concerned with the change.
She stabbed me with a kitchen knife, and I stitched it myself as she begged me not to go to hospital in case she got in trouble.
I was drinking a lot of alcohol to try and block out the pain. I ended up in hospital due to really high blood pressure and anxiety. I was suicidal.
It took a long time to realise how this has affected me, and many years to actually acknowledge that I possibly was a victim of domestic abuse. I get upset many times a week, a day. I don't get much sleep. I have a low mood a lot of the time, a lack of energy and interest in things I used to. I'm anxious for my child's well-being all the time. These feelings I feel are mainly after the contact with my child stopped, but heightened after the false accusations and a serious accident.
A huge level of anxiety as I was being painted out to be someone I'm not, second-guessing everything I do, walking on eggshells to avoid future conflict, feeling not in control of my own life and that of my children.
Significant impact on mental health. I had counselling due to suffering with severe anxiety, especially when I wanted to buy myself something. I remember wanting to buy a shirt, and I felt guilty for wanting it, as it would be spending money, and became incredibly anxious to what she would do and say if I did.
I'm a bitter, lonely man. I'm filled with rage and despair. I think of suicide most of the time. I don't trust other people. I'm 58 years old, and the last 20 years of my life have been grim, and they won't get any better. The control will continue until I'm in the grave.
I feel extremely restricted in my life, generally because of the consequences of doing things she doesn't approve of. I often have to meet friends in secret and feel I can't leave because of the threats in the past about suicide.
She would square up to me, but then say I was the one threatening her. When I got upset, she'd say I need to man up. When I didn't respond, she'd ask me if I was a mute. I tried to walk away from her a few times, and she'd block my way and say we weren't finished. On the few occasions I argued back, she made me feel like a monster shouting at her.
I feel like I'm disappearing and wish I could simply flick a button and stop existing to stop the constant pain. I cannot bear living without my little one, whom I was actively raising as a hands-on father, which I can and will prove. I love her and she is my heart. However, I don't think the system or the court cares into looking into this case from my point of view, and I'm dead on arrival. This has affected me beyond belief, and I feel like I'm slowly slipping into this dark thing that I'm not. Any traces of the kind, funny, happy, positive person that I was seem to have been corrupted by her and the system.
Deborah, thank you very much for talking to us.
It's an absolute pleasure.
What we wanted to do is to ask you about the research you're doing. We've shown some of the stories of the men that you've spoken to, so we have an idea of what people are experiencing, but it would be very interesting to understand the broader picture of what you're researching into and what you're finding. Could you just take that topic and go with it?
I think we need a couple of steps back, really, because I think when people are... My field is intimate partner violence. And I got into this field from personal experience. My first marriage was abusive. And I recognise all the elements of coercive control, which I'll talk about as we move forward. But if you're outside of the field, there is a certain perspective that most people in the population have, just ordinary people, those that don't spend their every day going through the details as such as I do. And the dominant view is that this is a issue that affects women. And the main view is that it only affects women, or in the very least, that it is overwhelmingly experienced by women. And that word's quite key. Or disproportionately affects women. There's some really emotive language that is very good at sectioning off certain groups of victims.
And people are suggesting the main problem is men, isn't it?
Yeah, and the main perpetrator is men. So often you're right, that sentence of this is something that disproportionately or overwhelmingly affects women and is perpetrated by men. So there's a couple of things that I have issues with that, again, I'll explain. But when you come into the field, it's very easy to find the data that backs up that narrative. But I'm in a psychology school at the University of Central Lancashire that is very progressive in the traditional sense of the word progressive. So they really do look at gaps in knowledge, and there is an expectation and a support for graduate students to identify those gaps, look into those gaps and find research to fill those gaps, which is the absolute foundation of a research PhD, is to identify gaps in the knowledge. So I'm very fortunate that my supervisor team is very much of that philosophy. And also my lead supervisor has spent a good couple of decades of her career looking at aggression as an overall field and looking at the etiology of aggression, how that manifests in different areas, and in particular, intimate partner violence and domestic abuse. So I had a really good, I was literally standing on the shoulders of giants as I went into this. But I went in from a personal perspective to try to discover, essentially on a personal level, how I got myself into the situation I had. That was my overriding personal question, because I didn't fit what I understood to be the template of a victim. It's often portrayed in the media that female victims are very, very vulnerable. They've often had issues in their life. It tends to be depicting of someone who's had a very unstable background, and it just paints a picture of complete vulnerability that didn't match with my experience. And it also didn't match with any of the experiences that I discovered along my recovery journey with other women and indeed other men. And I couldn't find the template where we could fit men because it didn't seem to exist.
No.
So I went and had a dig as my supervisors were nudging me in certain directions, and came across a whole body of data that we have stretching right back to the very early 80s or the late 70s that shows that men are victimized at similar or even slightly higher rates than women. And it feels like, and certainly the literature backs up that if men and women are having a physical fight, the likelihood is, and this is just common sense, that on average women are going to come off worse, because of the strength weight ratio. Men tend to be bigger. That's an evolutionary fact. So if a man hits a woman, he is likely to cause far more physical damage than if this was the other way around. And that seems to be the core tenet of what we know in the field as the gendered model. And it's very much backed and portrayed by the feminist theory of patriarchal power and control, female oppression, all those kind of patriarchal theory tenets.
Although if I could just interrupt, the message seems to be that it's just the fact that men are going to inflict more injury if their two genders fight, because men are bigger and stronger.
Yes. So often when I put forward the numbers of men that are even included in the Office of National Statistics shows that 1 in 3 victims is a man. And if you dig through the data, although they don't explain who the perpetrator is, and often even in the House of Commons, Victoria Atkins put on a sentence when she was talking about male victims of, but mainly victims of other men, which is untrue. The literature on aggression and tends to be that men inflict their aggression on their same sex, so they will be more aggressive against other men. But there's also evidence that shows women tend to be more aggressive against an opposite sex. So when you dig down into the numbers in the Office of National Statistics, the perpetrators are overwhelmingly, to use their language, women against men. But it also cuts out another, so we're missing this other big gap of male victims, which the data that goes all the way back to the 80s shows that is symmetrical to the victimization with women. We're also negating same-sex relationships, because if there is this patriarchal theory that is the monolithic view in the gendered model of why intimate partner violence occurs, then how do we explain lesbian relationships and the levels of intimate partner violence there? How do we explain gay relationships if there's not this central tenet of men trying to overpower and dominate women? It only explains. So that was my kind of grounding of it. Like this doesn't explain enough.
No.
This doesn't really show me how this happens across the board, because I talk to people and I talk to men who tell me that they are victims. I talk to women that tell me they are also perpetrators as well as being victimized. So all the actual lived experiences that I was part of in my recovery didn't match this patriarchal explanation. Don't get me wrong, I think there are a percentage of these of perpetrators that do actually think they have a right to overpower women. There's no doubt about it. I'm not negating that completely. However, most men and women don't function on that level. There are the chauvinists, and there have been forever. But I could also point at women that display those kind of traits towards men. That women should overpower men, they're better than men, kill all men, that we all men are trash, all that kind of stuff. You could apply a very similar element, not saying it's the same, but what I find most frustrating, and it is a real frustration about the gendered model. So we have the gendered model and the gender inclusive model, or family violence model. What I find most frustrating about the gendered model is I don't believe, and this is based in the literature and evidence, that it actually helps anybody including the people it says it's helping. Now, on a day-to-day frontline experience, it will help people. It will help women that need to get out of their house, women that need help with housing, women that need non-molestation orders. On a day-to-day level, the actual frontline workers that are there, not because their belief is pushing an agenda, but is their whole motivation is to help people to get out of that situation. I'm not actually talking about them when I say about my frustration, because they are doing a great job. And I can say that from personal experience when I've had help from those kind of people. And I really did getting out of my first marriage. What's frustrating is the sort of higher echelons of the theory and the academic theory and research that is put forward. That yes, if you're talking about female victims that are victims of male perpetrated domestic abuse, of course research it, of course look at solutions, look at how you can help those women, and then look at male perpetrators. But if you're looking at it from such a narrow lens that you think the monolithic view and monolithic reason that men commit this type of violence against those women is because of patriarchal theory and oppression, you're not actually going to help a female victim. And you're certainly not going to be able to rehabilitate or educate a male perpetrator, because you've stunted scientific inquiry at that point. You're not looking at trauma responses, adverse childhood effects, learned behaviour, mental illness, disorder, addiction, all the range of various reasons. And they are reasons, not excuses. They're two separate concepts. All the reasons why men and women commit intimate partner violence. It could even be something as simple as they've never been educated on conflict management. And people often ask me, and it sounds very flippant when I answer this, what's the leading indicator of risk of intimate partner violence? And I always say, and it always sounds really flippant, being in a relationship. Because that is the overriding factor, that if you're in a relationship, there is going to be conflict, whether that is a very mild conflict of it's your turn to take the bins out, or why didn't you do this, or the usual day-to-day conflict, right the way through to horrendous acts and murder. But if we don't acknowledge that there is a level of normal conflict that happens in relationships, then we're never going to start building on that. And then if we don't sorry, go on.
I was just going to ask you, Deborah, why do you think it's so difficult for people to hear the message that you have? Because we were hearing about DAPs. We were hearing from David Eggins and Denise Knowles about a different kind of DAP that they were offering, which is so different to the ones that are used in the family court. And it seems as though there are lots of parts of the establishment that certainly don't want to accept any of this and would rather continue to believe the things that are clearly not true.
Well, it's a vested interest, and I need to break that down into a number of elements. And firstly, on a psychological basis, people have built their worldview on that belief. That is a central belief to them, that women are oppressed and men are the oppressors, and any acts of oppression are violence towards women, whether that is, currently with what's been going on in the last couple of weeks, whether that is a wolf whistle or being approached in a bar, all the way through, which I think is really wrong to lump those behaviours to something as horrific as Sarah Everard's murder. It just seems to dilute actual serious issues like Sarah's abduction and murder to the same basis as a wolf whistle. Now, I've had a wolf whistle back in the day. I was sometimes I was embarrassed. Sometimes I told them where to get off. bit more strongly than that. But and other times I thought, well, still got it. There's various times. It's not. I don't think it's a one solid situation that you can absolutely label behaviour as. But, however, to take something what I would perceive as trivial as that and lump it into a whole explanation of something as serious as abduction and murder is incorrect on every level. They don't have the same etiology. They don't have the same motivations. I doubt very much if you went onto a building site and said to a man, did you just wolf whistle at that woman because you hate women and your overriding motivation is to abduct her and murder her? They would just go, no, she's a pretty girl. Just thought, well, hey, there's a whole, it's a very naive way of looking at these elements, and therefore doesn't supply any reasoned argument for the causes, and therefore doesn't supply any reasoned and evidence-based solutions. So we're all still back in the same place.
Yeah.
And it seems to fly in the face of a wish to actually gather evidence, because maybe the evidence doesn't support the ideology. But we're very concerned by the apparent in lack of access to any actual evidence and lack of interest in evidence.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. There seems to be, there's a fantastic article by Murray Strauss, who started he's a sociologist. He's no longer with us, sadly. But he started off and still all the way through his life identified as a feminist. And he started in the women's movement in America and went out to research intimate partner violence when it was in its infancy. And, we have to thank the feminist model for actually putting attention onto intimate partner and domestic violence. But things adapt, things change, things move on. But Murray Strauss was centre of the women's movement and tackling intimate partner violence, and went out and did some research and came back and said, actually, it's symmetrical. Men are victimised in similar ways, different but similar ways, still victimised by women. And he was excommunicated. He was absolutely vilified. He got rejected from tender when he was in the American system. And one of the people he was working with, Suzanne Stetz, she was run out of town effectively. This is really scandalous. And I don't know if you've heard of Erin Pitsey.
Yeah. Of course.
She she told me face to face, but she's written about this. She was also run out of refuge for saying that 61 of the women out of 100 in her refuge were as or more violent than the men. Now, it's difficult for people, and we're talking on a deep-seated, heartfelt belief system here. This is, for some, this is like telling them there is no God. This is something that they bulk about because they built their entire identity and worldview. And we know that in trauma victims, once your worldview is smashed, it takes a heck of a lot and a complete readjustment to come back from that and reform a new worldview. And that's what we're up against. It's not just a case of presenting evidence and someone saying, oh, I never knew that. That's really interesting. We will add that to our evidence base. This is dogma, because I've had various conversations with various people, both in real life and on social media, who I've put a stat out and got absolutely attacked. And I've said, so, okay, tell me how much information I need, how much evidence do you need me to provide for you to believe what I'm saying? And it comes back, there is no amount of evidence that you can provide that would change it. And I'm thinking, well, there we are. I'm not having this conversation then, because I can show you hundreds of scientifically robust articles, peer-reviewed articles based on tens of thousands of participants, male and female, that show you that there is symmetry across perpetration and victimization, and you still won't believe it. You will find a way to try and unpick that evidence to make it fit your worldview. But beyond that, people have also built careers on this. You know, there's a lot of industry around this. And how do you come back from that? If you spent 30 years putting out a belief system that says this is absolutely true and it's absolutely based on evidence and it absolutely cannot be challenged, and then someone says, excuse me, I'd like to challenge that. It's difficult. But I do think, again, when I'm talking to police officers and people in the Crown Prosecution Service and social workers and those people that are every day is out there, not sat in the ivory towers of academia or anything else, the real life people, they know it's true. You know, I've been in conferences where I've stood up and done my usual "what about the men" conversation, and been shouted down, as it were. Not shouted down, very politely. No, thank you very much. We don't want that today. where police officers and police detectives and senior police people, men and women, have stood up and actually said, no, she's right. We see it every day. We walk into that situation, but we're told that we have to handle it this way. And so they know the truth, but they are also constrained by policy and practice. That, okay, you might think it's this, but actually this is how we arrest, or this is how we remove people from the home, and again, I've spoken to various people in those that work in those situations that have said it actually makes me feel sick because I can see what's happening in front of me, but I'm told I have to do this. And actually, even things like if I do it this way, it's really easy. I just, there's one piece of paper I have to fill in and this, that, and the other. If I do it the opposite way, I have to fill in 10 different things. I have to get permission of someone else. I have to inform. So it's the path of least resistance. If you've got 10 cases that day and you still need to get home and feed your family and all the rest of it.
And you still want to keep a job.
Yeah, there's that as well, isn't there?
But it also means that people on the receiving end of these services can feel they're dealing with something completely inexplicable, a system which doesn't seem to listen and doesn't seem to be able to recognise evidence that's put in front of them. So you then feel that the system is mad or corrupt or in some way...
Or you feel you are,
or somebody's mad.
Yeah. So someone's... And I describe it as... And it's a known phenomenon. This is secondary victimisation. That you've come out of a situation where you've been victimised and you go and reach out to the very people that you want help from and they go, no, it's you. And believe me, in the worst cases of intimate partner violence, and there is a range of levels of abuse, in the very worst cases, you are totally exposed to being gaslighted every single day of your life. And that's what keeps a lot of people in those levels of abusive relationships, because you think it's you. You are made to think it's you. Yeah. So if you've actually processed that, and then you come out and you think, right, I'm going to go somewhere and I'm actually going to get some help and I'm going to get out of here. And it isn't me. I've finally come to realize it isn't me. And then you knock on the door of support and they go, oh no, it's you.
Wow.
Can you imagine what that would do to you?
Mad making.
It would just be phenomenal. I mean, I'm lucky that when I did pick up the phone, and I picked up the phone to one of the large organisations, they engaged help for me instantly. I had an advert, I was given advice, it was local advice, I had someone to turn to, I had all these different elements in place. And that's, when I say that on a one-to-one, day-to-day level, these organisations do help people. However, in the longer term, what if the people that they are helping are also abusing. And this is a bi-directional abusive relationship, because maybe that woman was brought up in a family where they saw domestic abuse, or they weren't taught conflict management, or they have an addiction, or they have an anxiety disorder, or they have whatever, all these different elements. If we don't actually tackle that, we help that woman. She goes out back into society, hopefully wants to get another relationship, has another relationship, and the whole thing goes off again. We've not actually tackled anything, and that's not blaming that woman for her victimization. But there's a big difference between responsibility and agency.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that victims are also aware. I, as a victim, know that I stayed in that relationship far longer than I should have done. Okay. That's not saying that I'm responsible for those years of abuse that I stayed there. But what it does is it makes me understand that I have a choice. I have agency over that. And if there's a certain thing that is getting to the point where I can recognize that, don't hang on out of loyalty or marriage vows or something like that. Now, that's given me agency. In no way is that victim blaming. That means that I can go forward with my life with the ability to protect myself. So we're letting women down in those situations.
Yeah.
We're also not really tackling, and there's an abundance of male perpetrator programs. We're not if we think that men only commit intimate partner violence because of power and control and oppression over women, how is that going to stop those men committing intimate partner violence on their next partner?
Sure, it lets down the victims as much as it lets down the perpetrators.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. So everyone knows that you shouldn't hit and harm anybody or grind down their spirit or all the various elements of coercive control. We all know that. Everyone does. Some people choose to still do it. And the perpetrator programs that are out there are very much, you really shouldn't do this. You're doing this because you think you're powerful. And then people sit there and nod for the amount of time that they're supposed to be there. And then they go out and nothing's changed.
No.
Because we all know that to be true. We all know that we shouldn't be doing it. But you're not tackling the actual core issue. So what if it's that man's got an addiction? Do you think by telling him he's an oppressor, he's just going to overcome his addiction? You know, there's so many different factors that's missing.
Yeah. So
and
naive,
it doesn't help
isn't it?
anybody.
No.
Well, I wanted to, before we finish, I wanted just to put to you, Deborah, this problem that people are going to be suspicious of your work because it seems to fly in the face of what they believe is true, and so they're likely to say that men are simply making excuses for themselves,
or making stories up, I suppose,
or exaggerating, annoyances by their ex-partner, or to justify their own behaviour. And
absolutely.
So you need to be able to defend the accounts you're getting, that you believe them to be true, and that they're not.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm quite fortunate. Like I said, there's a whole lot of literature that backs me up pre-me. Although, again, it doesn't seem to be out there widely in the. It just seems to float around in the ether somewhere. But I'm a mixed methods researcher. It's very complicated, convoluted way of just saying I do both quantitative and qualitative research. So quantitative, for those that don't know, is very much numbers and statistics. Qualitative is very much kind of asking open questions and getting answers back to add context. A lot of research tends to be either or, but there is more of a move towards combining those elements. So, and one of the reasons I wanted to have context is that, like you said, there's a real resistance to accept this as truth. So I wanted to have the statistical data because I can test robust methods there. I can put in statistical significance. I can actually measure it against a population measure and see if there's any differences and similarities and all the rest of it. That's solid. And what tends to happen, though, is that those that are bound to the gendered model will tend to try and unpick the instrument. So I've made sure the instruments are those that have been used across genders in victims, and have been widely used not just in trauma from intimate partner violence, but trauma in general. So when I'm measuring post-traumatic stresses, I've used something called the impact of events scale, which is used in everything from war, disease, natural disasters, HIV, cancer. There's a lot of trauma that it's been. So it's very robust and it's reliable and valid. But then often you'll get a criticism that says, well, that might be right, but what about the context? And that's why I asked about the context. And I'm a lover of language. I really listen when I listen to people, not necessarily to what they're saying, but how they are saying it. So I use a couple of pieces of software to look at the qualitative data. So the first one is quite popular in social sciences. It's called Nvivo, and it's a way of even just calculating word frequencies, so you can start to spot themes and you can analyze the data and you can link data. But then there's also something called Luke, which is developed by a social psychologist called James Pennebaker. And he looked, and he's been at this for a couple of decades at least. It's called language inquiry and word count. So it doesn't sound, it's Luke, but an acronym, not the name Luke. And what that does is it looks at various different ways a sentence is made up, how people use pronouns. In fact, he's got a book, I don't have it here, called The Secret Life of Pronouns. So an example of that would be if someone is, if you're concerned in someone's mental well-being, and you're concerned that they might be experiencing suicide ideation, what Luke has found in various different forms of research is that people that are experiencing suicide ideation tend to use first-person pronouns really frequently. I, me, and it's a psychological shutting out of the rest of the world, and they are retreating into themselves. And when you say it like that, it makes perfect sense. Anyone that's been in psychology or psychiatry can, as soon as you say this is how that would manifest, it's really common sense. But to see it in linguistic format it's actually quite incredible. It brings me out in goosebumps every time I do it. But amongst that is also a test for authenticity. So he's done a lot of research on actual lies and actual truths and all the rest of it. So I can also test on the authenticity of how people are describing their language. There is no full 100% way to say that this person is or isn't telling the truth. But as robustly as I can, I am testing that. And also, you can kind of spot it when someone is exaggerating, because it's like any lie. When people tell the truth, they tend to just give you a top line explanation for it. When people are telling a lie, they tend to put in too much detail. And it's just basic sort of linguistic deception. But you can spot it quite easily. But then you also have to map that over with how emotional people are thinking, or how they want to tell me the exact detail of everything and all the rest of it. And to be fair, I'm not seeing anything that would make me think this is a lie at all. There are things there that are so simplistic in their explanation, and you'll have heard some of that in the video. That it's true. You just know that the way that the sentences are formulated, the language that is used, you can tell.
It's tremendous.
And also, if you compare it to qualitative data with women, and there has been obviously a lot of research on female victims, there's a lot of similarities there. So if we're going to unpick that language, do we then unpick all the other? Or do we have, sorry to be sexist in this situation, but do we have a gentleman's agreement that as far as we're aware, this is the truth and this is what we're going to use as research?
I think that's tremendous. That's very solid. Now, what we'd like to do, Deborah, is talk a bit about the domestic abuse industry, which you touched on momentarily earlier.
Yes.
But I think that's another conversation which we can have.
It is.
We'll follow on with. So
Thank you.
we'll stop there now, and thank you very much for that.
Okay. It's a
Excellent.
pleasure.
Thank you.